Shalom Aleichem, mein teure Freund. Good afternoon, my friends. Welcome to the virtual Miles Nadal JCC. My name is Lisa Roy. I'm the manager of adult daytime culture and education at the Miles Nadal Jewish Community Center located in downtown Toronto. Sisa Falgenigen, it is my pleasure to be hosting today's virtual Meet the Author event featuring Rebecca Margolis. Today's event is co-presented by the Canadian Jewish Literary Awards and is presented in partnership with the Committee for Yiddish and the Israel and Golda Koschitzky Center for Jewish Studies at York University. We greatly appreciate you keeping yourselves muted, but I definitely encourage you to open your chat bubbles if you are able. It is wonderful seeing your comments and insights posted there. Since Rebecca lives in Australia with a substantial time difference, she has pre-recorded today's presentation. And so today's presentation is going to be in two segments. In the first, she will be sharing some of her research in an illustrated lecture, and then we will enjoy her interview with Edward Trapunski, chair of the Canadian Jewish Literary Awards, who is with us live on Zoom today. Both are absolutely wonderful. We are in for a real treat this afternoon. Depending on your internet speed and electronic device, you may experience some lag time during the screen sharing. Turning your cameras off and closing any extra applications open on your device may improve your video quality. If you experience any technical difficulties, please type a private chat to me, Lisa. I will do my very best to help you. I am so grateful to my wonderful JCC colleague, Deanna DiLello, who is smiling and waving, for stage managing today's program, to Culman Weiser and Julie Feinberg from York, Edward Trapunski, chair of the Canadian Jewish Literary Awards, and Cyril Troster from the Committee for Yiddish, for generously supporting this program. I now invite Cyril to say a few words on behalf of the Committee for Yiddish.
Thank you, Lisa. On behalf of the UJA Committee for Yiddish, I want to welcome everyone to this Meet the Author event with Rebecca Margolis, winner of the 2023 Canadian Jewish Literary Award. The Committee for Yiddish promotes the study and appreciation of Yiddish language and culture by sponsoring Yiddish language classes, lectures via webinars on a variety of topics, and support of concerts and films presented by Toronto Jewish cultural organizations. The work of Rebecca Margolis is so important for the promotion and documentation of Yiddish literature and culture today. Enjoy this session.
Ashenim Dank, Cyril. Thank you very much. And now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker. Professor Rebecca, or in Yiddish, Rivka Margolis, is Pratt Foundation Chair of Jewish Civilization at the Australian Centre for Jewish Civilization. She joined Monash University from the University of Ottawa in 2020. She has written journal articles and book chapters on Yiddish continuity, published studies on Holocaust literature and Yiddish music, and she authored Jewish Roots, Canadian Soil, Yiddish Cultural Life in Montreal, and most recently, the Yiddish Supernatural on Screen, Dybbuk's Demons and Haunted Jewish Pasts. Her primary area of research is the continuity of the Yiddish language in the areas of education, organizational life, literature, theater, and certainly serves as the basis of the subject of today's presentation, focusing on her award-winning publication, Yiddish Lives On, Journeys of Language Revitalization. So now, let us all sit back, relax, and enjoy watching Rivka's presentation.
Shalom Aleichem, teure Freund. It is my great honor and pleasure to be speaking with you today about my new book, Yiddish Lebt, Yiddish Lives On. I would like to thank the Miles Nadal JCC and Lisa Roy for making this event possible, and also the Yiddish Committee and my colleague and friend Oyzer Trapunski, who will be speaking with me shortly about the book. I'm going to start with a short PowerPoint where I'm going to talk about how the book came to be, what my findings are, and also sharing a song with you. I will begin with the acknowledgement of country, and you can see in the spirit of the book and its subject, Yiddish Lives On, Yiddish Lebt, that we in Melbourne, Australia, where I live, translated the acknowledgement of country into Yiddish. Wir anerkennen die Erstgesessene Obhiter von dem Land, wo wir treffen sich, und wir geben ob Covid sehr gewesene, itztige und kommendike Imes und Ovis. We acknowledge that we sit on the land belonging to the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. We pay respect to their elders, past, present, and future, as well as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across Australia. And here I would like to underline the significant parallels between the ways of reclamation happening among Indigenous languages and other lesser spoken or endangered languages, such as Scotch Gaelic, and Yiddish is on this list as well. One of the things that I've done in the book is drawn on the lessons from Indigenous languages and ways of language reclamation that are working effectively in those communities. I also sought to have this book be a potential model for other languages to show strategies through which languages could be transmitted outside of traditional family structures. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So this is the book cover. You can see from the design where my ideological perspective is. I think Yiddish is a living, vibrant, exciting space. I'm interested in how it has continued to be that way, even after the cataclysmic rupture of the Holocaust. Today, more and more young learners are flocking to Yiddish, and they're remaining involved with the language through cultural organizations and other avenues. So I'm interested in how that came to be. How did a language that really came as an immigrant tongue that really, for all intents and purposes, doesn't really have a rationale for living in a vibrant way outside of that first immigrant generation? And you can argue with me about that, but statistically, people tend to not maintain languages beyond the first generation. And so in this book, I'm interested to find out why it is that 100 years after or more after the mass immigration of Eastern European Yiddish speakers, we still have so many people invested in this language. And how has that come to be? And how has the engagement with Yiddish changed over time? I'm particularly interested in how this plays out among young people. So how is it, for example, that teenagers from the 1950s through today have managed to enrich their engagement with Yiddish in various ways? I'm also the author of 2 other books, and this book kind of sits between them. So Jewish Roots, Canadian Soil is a book that I wrote to look at the beginnings of Yiddish culture in Montreal. I also talk about Toronto and Winnipeg and Vancouver in this book, and you can see in the cover image that even then I was interested in how this manifested among young people. And then most recently, I just published a new book called The Yiddish Supernatural on Screen, where I look at how Yiddish appears in movies and on television to talk about difficult stories and supernatural events as ways of doing that. So this book, Yiddish Lives On, has 6 chapters, and I'm going to do just a quick overview so you know what's in the book. My first chapter talks about what the trajectory of Yiddish Canada has been and what the ideologies are. And one of those pieces is the split of Yiddish really into 2 groups. There's secular Yiddish, which is the Yiddish that I learned, the Yiddish that we see in public spaces across various institutions, organizations, CLES Canada, the Yiddish schools, etc., the Yiddish Committee. And then there's the other space, which is the Hasidic space, where Yiddish is spoken within communities to maintain a strong connection with a traditional Jewish life in Eastern Europe, and the language is transmitted within families and spoken within communities as a way of creating a boundary against the mainstream. So we have these two groups of Yiddish speakers with very limited contact between them. I speak about both groups in the book, but my major focus is on the secular group. Not that the Hasidic group doesn't offer a fascinating study, but my interest is in the sort of countercultural, deliberate strategizing that's happened around engaging with Yiddish in Canada, which is the case study that I offer in this book. So how is it that people have deliberately and strategically engaged with Yiddish, and what have they done in order to do that? So the first instance that I give here is family transmission. And I give that first because when I spoke with people about where their Yiddish came from, where they engaged with Yiddish, people inevitably brought up families. They either said, I learned Yiddish from my family and I spoke it with my grandparents, with my parents, or they said, I didn't. So my family spoke Yiddish, but they didn't speak it with me. Or I never had a Yiddish speaking family, and so I had to do the following things in order to learn Yiddish. So family is really at the core of people's thinking about how language transmission happens. And what I do in this chapter is I look at the Hasidic case of language transmission, where Yiddish really is transferred in a very natural way, where parents speak Yiddish to their children, children learn Yiddish in school, they play in Yiddish on the street, their lives are lived in Yiddish. And that is something that happened very deliberately in the Hasidic community when certain leading rabbis of big sects like Satmar decided that Yiddish needed to be promoted, that Hasidim had to speak Yiddish as a way of maintaining distinctiveness. And so that started happening over generations. And what it's meant is that Yiddish speakers in the Hasidic world who are young are more fluent than their parents and grandparents. So Yiddish use has increased, Yiddish fluency has increased. In the secular case, we have kind of the opposite, where as time has gone, fewer and fewer people have been in a position to transmit Yiddish within their families. We have rupture in transmission, where particularly after the Holocaust, a lot of families decided that it was not advantageous for them to speak Yiddish with their children. They wanted their children to speak unaccented English. And in some families, people persevered and decided they were going to speak Yiddish with their children, but in a lot of families, they didn't. So I look at a few cases where Yiddish was transmitted within a non-Hasidic family across 3 or sometimes 4 generations. I talk to people about how they do this, particularly when they're often the only Yiddish-speaking family in a particular area. What did they do? Why did they raise their children in Yiddish, and how did they do it? My third chapter looks at Yiddish in youth theater and activism. And what's interesting to me in this chapter is this is the 1960s and 70s. This is countercultural, youth-oriented culture. So what happened with Yiddish in this time? And what I found is that in the 1950s, the Dora Wasserman Yiddish Theater in Montreal became a driving force in Yiddish transmission among young people. So people who were raised hearing Yiddish at home or speaking Yiddish at home and were teenagers, that baby boomer generation, what happened with their Yiddish? And Dora Wasserman's theater became a space for an entire cohort of Yiddish-speaking kids. And after that, children and teenagers who weren't necessarily even exposed to Yiddish to be able to perform in Yiddish and engage with the language in a very, very vibrant and exciting space. So we're dealing here with a cohort of people who may have heard Yiddish growing up and may have learned it, but were not in a position where they spoke Yiddish horizontally. So they would speak Yiddish with their elders, with their parents, grandparents, but not with each other. Siblings didn't generally speak Yiddish with each other. So this is a moment where we have a shift in that pattern. And particularly in the creation of an organization called Jugendhof in the 1960s, Youth for Yiddish, which was co-founded by a Montrealer, David Roskis, who became a professor of Yiddish literature. And his view on Yiddish was, if we have this language that is so important and that we learned growing up, why can't I talk about sports? what he did with a cohort of teenagers and people in their early 20s was create an organization where young people from across North America and the world would gather together in small groups and improve their Yiddish, use their Yiddish, speak Yiddish with each other, commit to becoming people who transmitted the language within and across their own generation. And this organization still exists today. And it offers a fascinating model for how young people can be involved in language transmission. My next chapter, Yiddish Writing and Publishing, focuses on those European-born speakers of Yiddish who came to Canada and became very, very active in a literary scene. So they wrote and published as a way of engaging with Yiddish. And one of the things that happened over time is that more and more community support came into existence for that to happen. So books became symbols. They became monuments to what Yiddish could accomplish. And multiple writers, Mem Shafir, Yud Siegel, and others became very important figures in their communities and published large quantities of Yiddish writing in journals, in books. But what happened after that generation? Yiddish writing is a place where we don't have intercultural transmission happening. We have a very small cohort of second generation writers in the secular world, but the importance of that literature to new learners, people learning Yiddish and reading those works. And here, for example, Chava Rosenfarb has sparked a huge amount of new interest recently, people reading her work, translating her work. So the legacies of those writers have lived on. I also look briefly at Yiddish writing and publishing in the Hasidic world, where there has been an increasing trajectory of people publishing what we would call creative writing in Yiddish. Then I move on to chapter 5, Yiddish singing, which I will put aside because I'm going to come back to it in a minute. And then finally, Yiddish in new media and cinema. And this is a particular interest of mine. How do people create, use new technology to create new things in Yiddish? So YouTube videos, films, and other things. And what is the dynamic there of translating texts into Yiddish in films like The Pin or Yid Life Crisis, where we have this interesting translation dynamic. So the central questions of my book are: why does language matter? What is Yiddish, Hasidic and secular? What challenges has Yiddish faced as a language and culture? And number 4, most importantly, what strategies have emerged to transmit the language, especially among young people and new learners? And as a new learner myself, I'm fascinated by how this continues to unfold, that people continue to flock to Yiddish, sometimes using Duolingo, sometimes through classes, sometimes by learning on their own. How and why are people continuing to engage with Yiddish? We have to just pause here to note that Yiddish has never had a homeland. So there's Birobidzhan in the former Soviet Union, which remains a place where Yiddish can identify a homeland, but practically speaking, most Yiddish speakers never lived in Birobidzhan. So we don't have a homeland. We don't have reciprocal migration happening, particularly after the 1920s, between Eastern European Yiddish speakers and Yiddish speakers in Canada. So how is it that we've had this ongoing continuity? And number 5, finally, what can other languages learn from the example of Yiddish? I learned a lot from other languages like Scottish Gaelic and Indigenous languages in terms of language transmission. So there are very interesting strategies happening there. But I also wanted this book to be usable for people working on language reclamation in other areas, so they could read the book and maybe get some ideas, some strategies of things that happened with Yiddish that were successful. So my theoretical model for this book is visually represented here in something I call concentric circles of Yiddish. And basically what it shows is that as you move between the circles, you're moving into more and more inclusive use of Yiddish. New technology, for example, anybody can watch a YouTube video. It's very accessible, very, particularly if it's subtitled, something anybody can access. Singing, you sometimes need to know a little bit more Yiddish. Literature, you need to be able to read the language. Community activism, there you need to have some kind of vested interest. Theater performance is included there. There you need to have an interest in performing, going on stage, and also the facility to be able to do that in Yiddish. And family use, that requires a family that's Yiddish speaking that wants to transmit the language to you. And what I found in this book is that people generally move among multiple circles. So for example, somebody might watch a YouTube video and decide they want to take a Yiddish class. And then in the Yiddish class, they might sing and then learn to read and become engaged with literature. And they might start translating literature. And then they might get involved with performance. And then ultimately, that person might decide they want to raise a child in Yiddish, which happens. And so that is how those concentric circles of Yiddish inform my analysis in the book. So now I'm going to do a deep dive into Yiddish singing, which is chapter 5 of the book. This was my favorite chapter to write because I got to do some really fun field work, going and visiting choirs, going to the Kles Canada Music Festival, and thinking about how Yiddish singing informs Yiddish transmission. So how can you transmit a language through song, and how does song augment that process? The theory that I use here is something called heterotopic Yiddish land, which was developed by Abigail Woods in her book, All Brothers, which is a study of Yiddish singing. And she draws on Michel Foucault's philosophy of heterotopia, which is the idea that there are other spaces, and I've written here, where imagined and real can coexist. So other spaces that run parallel to our own spaces, but that are markedly different in some way. An example is a cruise ship. So a cruise ship, you sleep, you eat, you do activities, you eat, you sleep. So the pattern of life is the same on a cruise ship, but it's a very different kind of place that exists outside of normal reality. And heterotopic Yiddish land argues that when you engage with Yiddish, you create these moments outside of regular time that are fully immersed Yiddish moments. So Yiddish singing offers an example. If you get together with a group of people, you sing a song in Yiddish, you are at that moment in a heterotopic Yiddish land. You are in a profoundly Yiddish informed space with other people, and it's aligned with your regular life, but also sits separate and outside. And so what we find with Yiddish singing is that you have an atemporal experience of Yiddish. You align past and present. You're singing songs from a variety of origins. They can be folk songs. They can be songs written 100 years ago. They can be new things. And so you're moving across time. It's inclusive. So singing a Yiddish song can happen in a room with people of different ages, different knowledge levels, different backgrounds, different ideological perspectives. Yiddish is very important within immersive environments. So for example, Kles Canada, where you are living a full week in this Yiddish space, Yiddish is absolutely instrumental there, but also in Yiddish learning environments. So I, for example, have been teaching Yiddish in immersive environments in Yiddish summer programs for about 25 years now. And I always use Yiddish. And this is something, I always use Yiddish singing. I use Yiddish also, but I always use Yiddish singing. And the reason that I do that is because it builds this sense of community. It also relaxes people. People get happy when they sing. It's a way of teaching language. It's a way of teaching dialect and culture. And so I always use Yiddish singing in my teaching. And I was gratified to learn that the Scottish Gaelic College in Cape Breton that teaches Scotch Gaelic also uses singing in all of their teaching. And in fact, they begin their classes with singing. So singing is very significant to Yiddish learning. It's significant to Yiddish continuity. It's significant to people's sense of engagement with Yiddish. It's very often a first entry point for people into becoming more involved with the language and the culture. So I'll use here the example of Kles Canada, which is some of the field research that I did for the book, where I went to the 2019 Kles Canada and I observed. And one of the things that I found fascinating was the sing-along, which was led by Soramina Gordon, who you can see in this picture, the daughter herself of Hannah Cooper, a very well-known Yiddish singer who unfortunately passed away about 15 years ago. And Soramina Gordon was raised in a Yiddish-speaking home. She is a singer and an artist, and her leadership of the sing-along really emphasized the community feel of that event. So you can see in the picture, there are people of various ages, people of different backgrounds, and they're coming together for the sole purpose of singing together. And the way that Soramina ran the sing-along was that she would say, okay, here's a songbook that I've compiled with all different songs that people love. What do we want to sing? And people would call out the name of a song, and she would guide everyone in singing together with musical accompaniment. And what this meant was that singing became kind of this idealized space. It was inclusive, it was educational, it was temporary, so people could come in and out, so accessible, politicized, and fun. And so this, to me, is an optimal example of heterotopic Yiddish land. And I'm going to just sing a song with you. I'm not going to sing. The klezmatics are going to sing. So I'm going to play part of this song with you for you now. And what I would love is for you to follow the lyrics either in transliterated English or in Yiddish. And imagine that you're in a space with people across different times. So this song has existed for a long time. It's a folklore song that Morris Winchevsky adapted into a Yiddish song about 100 years ago. And then a group called the Klezmatics adapted again in the 1980s and has been singing ever since. So imagine yourself as part of that chain of transmission. And the lyrics you can see here also play into that. So the lyrics in English are roughly, we are all brothers, we are all one. We stay together no matter how many we are. We love each other like a bride and groom. Oi, oi, oi. So those are the traditional words. There are also two additional stanzas that are added to the end that the klezmatics created, which is Und wir seien alle Schwester, we are all sisters, azoi wie Rachel, Ruth und Esther, like Rachel, Ruth, and Esther. And this is a nod to the feminist stream within Yiddish language and culture, where we have a very strong history of women's involvement in modern political life, literary life, cultural life, etc., in addition to the very important roles that women played in traditional Yiddish culture and continue to play in that culture. And then there's another verse, Un mir seinen alle freilich, oi, oi, alle freilich, azoi wie Jonathan und David Amelech, oi, oi, oi. And this is, we are all happy, we are all gay, like David and Jonathan. And this is a nod to the very important presence of queer Yiddishkeit within Yiddish engagement. So people who identify as non-heteronormative, non-heterosexual, coming together under the umbrella of Yiddish in order to create art and explore their identities. So I'm just going to play a little bit of the song. I'm going to stop share for a minute and just make sure that I have the sound shared. So I encourage you to enjoy this moment. I'm going to play about a minute of the song, and I encourage you to find it and listen to it on your own if you're not familiar with it.
Und wir seien alle Brüder, oi, oi, alle Brüder. Und wir singen freiliche Lieder, oi, oi, oi. Und wir halten sich in einem, oi, oi, sich in einem. Als welches ist nicht aber keinem, oi, oi, oi. Oi, 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 oi,
So I'm going to pause there, but that's just a taste of one of the favorite songs of Yiddish learners, Yiddish singers. One of the things that frequently happens in Yiddish gatherings is that people will spontaneously start to sing. It's a very singing culture. And so I'm going to now just move on to one more dimension of CLES Canada and the role of singing in that environment. I just want to point to the children's program as another space where Yiddish transmission happens. Not that a children's program in a week of cultural festival will lead to fluent Yiddish transmission, but it's a space where children learn to love Yiddish. They engage with Yiddish, particularly through music. It's fun, it's interactive, and it's the start. So in my concentric circles, in my mind, this is a space where people get a taste of Yiddish in some cases. Some of these children are fluent speakers, but some of them are encountering Yiddish for the first time. And it plants that interest in that love for Yiddish that very often leads people to come when they're in university to learn Yiddish and become fluent speakers. That little girl, incidentally, is my daughter, Bina. So very cute moment there for us. On the right there, you can see I have labeled this image identities. So this is two leaders of a workshop at CLES Canada talking about leftist ideologies. And here you can see the way that Yiddish is youth-oriented. It's a space where young people and people of all ages are situating themselves as a way of defining their identities, sometimes in relationship to, sometimes in opposition to other Jewish identities. So for example, people who want to be Jewish culturally, but not Jewishly observant will often gravitate towards Yiddish as a space where that can happen. So Yiddish is a language, again, with no country, no homeland. It's a non-hegemonic space for people who want to explore their identities through language and not necessarily through other forms. And this kind of Yiddish engagement increasingly is attracting people who don't identify Jewishly or who recently found out that they have Jewish heritage and want to explore that. So my takeaways in the book are the following. Number one, language transmission does not have to be complete or constant. So when we talk about Yiddish transmission or transmission of other languages, it's not a zero-sum game where you're either transmitting it or you're not. So parents who are not sure about whether they should be engaging with Yiddish at home and they're considering it, you don't have to speak Yiddish all the time with your children and have them be fluent speakers to have that happen in a meaningful way. Singing, is playing games in Yiddish. These are strategic ways to have that engagement happen, to create that heterotopic Yiddish land as part of a child's development without there having to be fluency or bilingualism, which is often very difficult to do in a language like Yiddish. Second takeaway, this works best in an inclusive collective. So when we're talking about what I call in this book, creative language spaces, which is the term that I use for this heterotopic Yiddish land, the inclusive collective is the optimal environment where people of different ages can come together and engage in Yiddish activity, where there isn't that sense that there are the people who hold the privilege of being more fluent, and then there are the people who are less fluent. My favorite Yiddish spaces are the ones where people come together at different levels of knowledge, different backgrounds, and tackle a text or sing or put on a play, performance, some kind of a project, or learn together from each other. Number three, it needs to be meaningful or enjoyable. So for a creative language space to be a functional heterotopic Yiddish land, people have to want to be there. Particularly today when there are so many other options for people to express their cultural interests, their creativity, their political ideologies. For Yiddish to be an attractive space, there needs to be meaning and it has to be enjoyable. So sometimes even just a social activity in Yiddish can be very, very significant. Technology is important. So we all know post-Zoom, the fact that I'm speaking to you over a Zoom recording, technology is a very important way of engaging with Yiddish and is not inferior to face-to-face engagement with Yiddish. And the reason I say that is because Yiddish speakers are so dispersed in the world today that the likelihood of having 20 Yiddish speakers in a room is quite low outside of major centers like Toronto, New York, Montreal. But over Zoom, you can gather together sometimes dozens of people in a cultural event. So very significant and a positive change for Yiddish. Many people gravitated towards Yiddish during Zoom, just because it offered that heterotopic space, that happy, enjoyable environment. And finally, anyone can participate. So my attitude towards Yiddish engagement is that if you haven't yet engaged with Yiddish, come on and try it. There are so many opportunities, both face-to-face, virtual, and also more passively engaging with Yiddish culture. And because of all of this, I am eternally optimistic about the future of Yiddish. There was a moment about a generation ago where people doubted whether Yiddish would continue. People wrote books that Yiddish was dead and it was the end. And in fact, there's been a major upturn of Yiddish and a reclamation of Yiddish, both by heritage speakers and descendants of Yiddish speakers and people from outside of that context. So to my mind, the future of Yiddish is very, very bright, and it's an exciting, wonderful place to be. Ashenim Dank.
My friends, I hope that you all enjoyed that very much. I had a huge smile on my face the day that Rebecca emailed it to me. I really loved her slide that showed the concentric circles of Yiddish, and what a treat that we got to see a photo of her daughter. So Rivka, thank you for making that, so personal. And I think it was really just an enlightening presentation. So that was part one. And now I invite Edward Trapunski, who is the chair of the Canadian Jewish Literary Awards, to say a few words.
Hello, everybody, and thank you to Lisa for arranging this, and also to Rebecca, who her presentation was terrific. The Canadian Jewish Literary Awards is really proud to partner with the Miles Nadal JCC to present its award-winning authors. And I'm really delighted to have been able to interview Rebecca Margolis for this event. We both share a profound love of Yiddish, as you could see from her presentation, and you'll hear also in our interview. And I want to thank her for her scholarship and for her passion. And because of her scholarship and passion, it's really true that Yiddish does live on. The 2024 Canadian Literary Awards call for submissions is now open. If you have a book you think might be eligible, visit our website and submit. And if you have any friends and colleagues who've written books in the past year, let them know about it as well. We'd like to read their books as well. The Canadian Jewish Literary Awards is entering its 10th successful year. It celebrates, acknowledges, and rewards the finest Canadian Jewish writing on subjects with Jewish themes every year. It builds pride in the creative achievements that reflect Jewish themes and ideas. Culture is a major measure of the vibrancy of Jewish life in Canada. The Canadian Jewish Literary Awards contributes to the health of that communal culture by promoting not just Jewish writers and editors, but also Jewish ideas, creativity, and scholarship. Recognizing the best Jewish books of the year allows us to better understand ourselves, to understand our collective past and our shared present, and the uncertain world of our future, especially now. For more information about the Canadian Jewish Literary Awards, our Autumn Awards Gala, and the past winners, visit our website. I'm inviting you to the Canadian Jewish Literary Awards Gala for the presentation of the awards in this coming autumn. Save the date. It's free and open to all. And this year, we're planning to present the awards here at the Al Green Theatre. So for more information about the Canadian Jewish Literary Awards, visit our website and find out about it. And now I'm really pleased to be introducing Rebecca Margolis. We had a wonderful conversation, and I'm sure that you're all going to enjoy it. Hello, Rebecca. How are you doing? Really happy to be able to talk to you today about your book, Yiddish Lives On. And my first question to you really is, does Yiddish live on? How is Yiddish being transmitted today?
First, it's so wonderful, Boiser, who I've always known as Edward until we started talking about having this conversation. And now I know you as Oizel, which is such a beautiful name. And I've got a poem that Oizel sent me that was written about him, which I'll share in a minute, so you can all learn what Oizel means in Yiddish. But the reason that I wrote this book is because I'm a new learner of Yiddish. I learned Yiddish at the Jewish People in Paris schools in Montreal. I learned it through in involvement with sort of local Yiddish people, Yiddish activities, friends of my grandmother's. And growing up, I just assumed that this was sort of a normal thing, that people of my age would learn Yiddish and be exposed to Yiddish and have knowledge of the language. And I remember going with my high school friends to swimming pools. And if we didn't want people to know what we were saying, we would speak Yiddish to each other. And this was our language. It belonged to us in some way. And then when I moved outside of the Montreal Yiddish circles, I realized that that was actually unusual. And people my age were not using Yiddish in this way. They were maybe using Yiddish words or Yiddish expressions, but they didn't have a sense of belonging, of engagement with this language. And sort of I carried that through with me for 20 years, thinking about it. What is Yiddish transmission? What does it mean that I feel a sense of connection with this language? I studied it in university. I got a PhD in Yiddish. I lived in New York. I got to know all of these Yiddish people from different generations. Yiddish is really important to me, but how do I articulate what that means? And how do I not feel like an imposter in this culture, which I'm a newcomer to? I learned Yiddish. I learned about Yiddish. I didn't grow up with Yiddish the way a lot of people have. And so I wanted to sort of deal with that question. So when people say Yiddish is dead or dying, I completely reject that premise. It's not. I think people, it feels comfortable to say Yiddish is dead or dying, because then you don't feel a responsibility to sort of learn it or transmit it. You think, well, it's dying anyway, I'm just going to let it do that. But on the other hand, there are all of these particularly young people who have been coming for 20, 30 years, 40 years, coming to learn the language and join the culture and are excited about it. So we have this sort of phenomenon of people wanting to say, oh, it's dead. But then how do you explain all these people who keep coming and gravitating towards Yiddish? So I wanted to write a book where I gave people some language to talk about their experiences of Yiddish, where they don't say, well, you know what, I failed at Yiddish. I didn't pass it on to my kids. I don't speak it all the time. I'm not fluent. Or people who I know who joined Yiddish community organizations and are not fluent and say, you know what, I feel like an imposter. What am I doing in this space? I shouldn't be here. It's not mine. And so I wanted to write a book that says, no, what you're doing is legitimately Yiddish transmission. And there are all these different ways that can happen. And Yiddish is such an exciting space. And especially in Canada, there have been so many different things people have done that I think are dynamic and exciting. And I think inspiring, not just in the world of Yiddish, but to other languages where people are thinking, I've got this language that I want to connect with. How do I do that? And what does it mean when I do it? So that's my sort of long answer to your short question.
I'm a couple of generations ahead of you, and I also went to the Yiddish Volksschule and learned Yiddish there, and it was very much a part of the milieu, that there was a real strong sense of Yiddish going to the Volksschule. And also I grew up in a Yiddish household. My father was a Yiddishist, and Yiddish was part of what he spoke with his friends, and I thought everybody knew how to speak Yiddish. But moving further along, my sons don't speak Yiddish. They have a smattering of the colorful terms, and the question really is how to transmit it to their generation, which is one generation below you.
Yeah, which is a really good question. And I think a lot of it has to do with creating spaces where Yiddish draws people. And I don't think that the onus to do that is on the generation of native speakers. I think the onus is on the people who themselves feel drawn to Yiddish. So what I mean, for example, is in Melbourne, I have a friend and colleague, Esther Singer, who read my book and thought, that's an interesting idea. There's this concept that I developed in the book called created language spaces. So we create these spaces where we engage with Yiddish. And there's this concept that I incorporate of heterotopia, heterotopic Yiddish land, which is the idea that there are, in our lives, we have these parallel spaces that resemble our regular life but are apart. Like if we go on a cruise is not our normal life, but it feels kind of like a version of our normal life in that we have a routine and you go there and you do some things, but they're separate. So my created language spaces concept is that if you go and you sing in a Yiddish choir, you go to a Yiddish conversation group, you have some kind of an interaction with Yiddish, even online, even very passive, you're carving out a space for Yiddish, and that's a moment where Yiddish is being used and transmitted. And one of the things I argue is that the optimal way to do this is to have it be enjoyable and inclusive and fun and embodied, participatory. So for example, a Yiddish choir or a Yiddish sing-along or some sort of an event where people are together and enjoying time in Yiddish, to me is an optimal way where Yiddish gets transmitted, because it's really outside of the Hasidic world where there are hundreds of thousands of speakers who are speaking Yiddish at home and using it in their communities. Outside of that Hasidic context, for the rest of us who are not Hasidic, it is not necessarily feasible to carve out huge expanses of time where we use Yiddish. And people ask me, how much do you speak Yiddish in a week? And the answer is it varies. But mostly I think in Yiddish a lot, and I use Yiddish, and I do a lot of media study with Yiddish, and I engage with Yiddish in these different ways. But I don't speak Yiddish with my partner and my daughter at home. It's not something that I do, but I don't feel like I failed as a Yiddishist, as somebody connected with Yiddish. I have very particular ways where I engage with Yiddish. And I think for my generation, for the millennials, the Gen Zs and Alpha, all of those other generations that are coming, they're gravitating towards Yiddish, and they're doing it in ways on their own terms. They're not saying, well, my parents want me to speak Yiddish all the time, so I will, because they think it's important. They're coming towards Yiddish because it speaks to them. They're attracted to the culture, to the creativity, to the ideological left-wing connections. They're connected because of Frumkeit, because of traditional Yiddish. Religious practice, a lot of it, historically happens through Yiddish. So there are all these doorways in, portals into Yiddish. And I think people are finding their way. And there's not one overarching sort of answer like, you must send your child to a Yiddish school, you must speak to them in Yiddish all the time or we fail. That's a zero-sum game. And I don't think it works for languages.
You talked about the draw of Yiddish, and there really is a draw. There's an audience here that's listening to us, and even you say you don't speak it in the street, but you do in a lot of ways. My sons do in a lot of ways because it's fun. It's a colorful language. Is that what the draw is? That there's so much color to it. There's so much expression to Yiddish, and there's something also about the feeling of the mamaloshen, that this is the language that you're brought up with, that you feel comfortable with, and it feels like home. Is that what it is?
I think that's definitely one piece. I think there's a huge element for people who are descendants of Yiddish speakers, particularly Yiddish speaking immigrants who brought the language with them. Right. There's this sense of legacy, and very often it skips a generation. So I, for example, had the great privilege of teaching Max Weinreich in my Yiddish class in an intensive summer program. Max Weinreich was a very, very famous linguist, the father of Uriel Weinreich, who wrote the college Yiddish textbook. But Max Weinreich was the great grandson of the original Max Weinreich. And he was studying physics at university and had not grown up and exposed to Yiddish. And for him, it was a return. And I take him as an example because there is a lot of that dynamic of people returning to Yiddish, realizing it's part of their heritage, and not just wanting to go back and have nostalgia, but wanting to go back and really get inside the language and speak it and learn it and interact with the language in some way. So that's one dynamic. But there's also a dynamic of people coming to Yiddish with no connection at all. People without any Jewish background whatsoever, who are attracted to Yiddish because it has associations with the arts. They hear a Yiddish song and they love it. They fall in love with it. They see a Yiddish performance. They come across a reference to a Yiddish writer is something that they're reading about the left wing, and they identify as interested in socialism. And so they make their way to Yiddish that way. There's also this very prominent discourse of Yiddish right now as a non-hegemonic language. So it's not a language of a majority. It's never had its own nation state. So it's a language of the margins, a language of the sort of, people use the term alterity. So the non-normative, non-heteronormative spaces where people who might have otherwise found themselves on the margins of whatever community can move towards being with other people who share their viewpoints. And I'll give an example because that sounds very academic-y. So an example of that is the great draw of Yiddish to queer people who identify as queer or as non-binary. So there's this very large subculture of Yiddish called queer Yiddishkeit, where people are doing performances and writing comics and graphic novels and creating events. There's this dynamic of wanting to pull together what I call, and what others have called, I call it when I teach, I say it's a usable past. So we look at the history of the Yiddish language and everything that's been created, and we say, what do we want to take from that to build our own identity, our own way of interacting with the language? And I think there are so many ways that can happen, and there's so much happening, particularly online. COVID was a nightmare. I'm just going to preface what I'm going to say with that. It was terrible for everyone, but very good for Yiddish, because for a lot of people on lockdown, Yiddish was this safe, happy space. You know, they had their Yiddish community. Life is terrible, but I have a Yiddish conversation class that I can go to, and I can forget for a little bit. We're not going to talk about COVID in Yiddish. We're going to do other things. I know people who were up sometimes 20 hours a day, going across 12 time zones to do Yiddish activities during COVID. So that's just an example of the kind of, I think, the kind of engagements people are having. And it's so much above and beyond, oh, it's Seinfeld, Yiddish is funny, Yiddish is cute. You know, the mugs with the, you know, vulgar words on them. We've moved sort of way beyond that as a way of people connecting with Yiddish.
You were talking about Yiddish as a language of a minority. When I was growing up, it was the language of the majority. The people in my neighborhood spoke Yiddish, and we were exposed to Yiddish culture. Right? My household, Melech Ravitch and Rahel Korn and Ida Massey would come over and drink tea in my house, and that was my exposure to what Yiddish was about. You don't get that anymore.
I wish. So David Roski's had a similar experience of Yiddish growing up, and he wrote a memoir called Yiddish Lands,
Right.
where he talks about, you know, everybody just came into his house. He would sit under the dining room table and listen to these great writers and poets, talk to his parents about everything. And they're, you know, part of me really wishes I could create some kind of virtual reality setting where we could experience that. And I would call it the Yiddishism, the Yiddish street. And I would create, you know, one in Warsaw, one in New York, one in Montreal. You know, I would do various versions, and then you could go in there and interact. That's kind of a dream I have when the technology becomes feasible, because my God, that would have been amazing to have that experience of being in that Yiddish land that we don't have to piece together. Because honestly, outside of the Hasidic world, if you want to have sort of an immersive Yiddish life, you really have to work at it, because there's no more Yiddishism that's outside of the Hasidic world. And scholars have pointed to this, that sort of the fall of the Yiddishism, or the movement out of the Yiddishism into the suburbs, as being one of the factors behind why we have this decline in Yiddish usage. We have this rupture because it's a lot harder to transmit a language when it's just you and your family in a house and no one around you is speaking the language anymore. Then it becomes your own project and it becomes a thing you have to do versus it's just around you. And you send your kids up the street to the Jewish Public Library in Montreal and there's a Yiddish program and you go to the Yiddish theaters down the street, and you bump into people. And I don't think there's any way of replicating that dynamic anymore.
Well, they do have Yiddish theater now. I was just reading about a revival of Hester Street in Yiddish today in Washington. But what I'd like to get to is the fact that what you're saying is that it's not the Yiddish of the household anymore, it's become the Yiddish of the classroom. And is that what Yiddish has become? Is it become just for academics, or is it broader than that? Just for academics and Hasidim, or is it broader than that?
I think it's a lot broader, but I think it's largely thanks to the classroom. So I think when I was studying Yiddish and moving into sort of more fluency, this was in the mid-1990s. So I was in Montreal at McGill, and then I went to New York at Columbia, and I had my whole circle of Yiddish elders. I had Mordechai Schechter, the linguist, and his sister Bela Gottesman Schechter, who's a poet and a writer. And these were people I considered to be close friends. I was also friendly with Gela Schweid-Fishman and her husband Schickel Fishman. There was this cohort of people who were really committed to Yiddish transmission. And in New York City was the Yiddish summer program, the Oriel Weinreich Yiddish summer program, which is a 5-week intensive, which has basically trained pretty much everybody in my generation who is a Yiddish speaker or who learned Yiddish. And most of us were academics coming in. But once we were in the program, there's a lot of blurring between being an academic and studying something and being a participant. And this is something that people have observed in Yiddish, is that the line between the Yiddishists, the Yiddish creatives, the Yiddish writers, artists, and the people who study them, there's often no line at all. We're the same people. We're sort of studying our own phenomenon. And so, yes, there's a lot of importance on the Yiddish that happens in the classroom and virtually on Duolingo. There are so many ways to learn Yiddish, but it's moved beyond that into people taking what they learn and then starting their own projects. So doing their own creative work, their own productions. And there are a lot of examples of people in their 20s and 30s who've learned Yiddish in a classroom and then become very creative.
You talked about 2 areas that you grew up in. One was Montreal, one was New York, which are the real centers of Yiddish, but not everywhere in the world. Even Toronto, where we're sitting today, is not a center for Yiddish. Why was it Montreal and New York that became those centers for Yiddish? Why wasn't it Toronto? And what can we do about it?
These are good questions. I think a lot of it has to do with personalities. So it's really strong-willed, sometimes really enthusiastic people who led Yiddish activity. So in Montreal, we have a long list of people who were just really important in establishing institutions. And again, once a language moves out of the family as the primary place where it gets passed on, then institutions become really important. So then the schools become important. And in Montreal, you have the Dora Wasserman Yiddish Theater. Dora Wasserman was a force to be reckoned with, right until the very end. And I think having a combination of people, particularly people who survived the Holocaust and then brought with them their desire to transmit something into future generations, not just in their families, but in the community more broadly. I think people bringing that vision and their very strong personalities, sometimes it's just a felicitous thing that in Montreal, you just had these really powerful Yiddishists who were committed to different areas of activity in Yiddish, and they managed to work together and not splinter, which is often the thing that will bring a community into prominence, is that people are able to work together across various domains and do amazing things. And New York just had the numbers. New York had 2 million Yiddish speakers moving through it in a very short period of time. So New York is numerically just the center for Yiddish. But then there are people who are studying Yiddish in far-flung locations across the world, and sometimes you meet them, you go to an online thing, and there's somebody from Japan, or somebody from a town you've never heard of in Uzbekistan. People gravitate towards Yiddish, and it's the geography of it is more virtual than I think it ever was before because of technology. And people, I think, who are interested in Yiddish no longer feel isolated the way they used to feel, because you can join your weekly Zoom gathering, do your Yiddish class if you're willing to deal with the time difference. I'm in Melbourne, so for me it's 10:30, and for you it's 7:30 p.m. But if you're willing to manage all of that, there's just a lot out there. So the prominence of Montreal and New York, I think it's the personalities. It's also the fact that those cities were so close to each other, are so close to each other, and so you have a lot of
Toronto too, and
Yeah.
it's right here.
Yeah, Toronto is tricky because Toronto developed later as a city, and it wasn't seen as sort of a really prominent Jewish place until the 1970s, when so many Montrealers resettled to Toronto. So when you were looking at the map thinking, well, where do I want to go? If you're a Yiddish-speaking Holocaust survivor, you're being sponsored by a family member, you're going to go where they are, and chances are they were in Montreal. And similarly in New York, you would go where the people were, and so that built up that sense of community. But personally, I think Yiddish in Toronto is an exciting place to be, again, because of personalities, and also because there's the Ashkenaz Festival, and there's a fantastic Yiddish graduate program at U of T that Anya Stanchis has nurtured over the years. And so you have these shifting centers of Yiddish historically. Yiddish has its high points in different places. And I think Toronto is now on my list of really important places in the world where Yiddish is flourishing. And a lot of it has to do with people and institutions.
What about where you are? What about in Australia? Does it spread there too?
Well, Melbourne has its own Yiddish history. And in Melbourne, people call this place Eckveld, the end of the world, because, and even now it takes, 30 hours to travel from here to North America. And so Yiddish in Melbourne has developed across sort of along its own distinct trajectory. For example, the pronunciation. So Melbourne Yiddish people say oif for on, the preposition. Everybody else says ah for oaf. In Melbourne, they insist on saying oif, and they proudly do that. And if someone corrects them, they get very fidgety and they say, no, that's how we speak Yiddish. They have maintained a very strong connection with the Yiddish dialects. So the sort of authentic ways of speaking that people brought with them, because again, most of the community in Melbourne was established after the Holocaust. And so it's this group of people who form these strong connections. There's a very strong presence of the Bund in Melbourne, and there's a Yiddish youth arm of the Bund called SCIF, which is the Sozialistische Kinderverband. They run summer camps and youth groups, and a lot of the leaders in that organization are Yiddish speakers from home, and they use Yiddish as part of that organization. So there's music, and there's culture, and there's this real sense of being distinct, but there's also a sense of continuity with what was in Eastern Europe before. And of course, because since COVID, virtually, there's more connection now than there was before with the rest of the world.
You were talking about immigration out, the immigration, for instance, from Montreal to Toronto. I think of immigration in. I come from a Litvish background. My father was from Golda, and I think of the fact that in Montreal, a lot of people spoke Yiddish because they came from that Litvak background. And in fact, you talked about dialect. Sometimes it's hard for me to understand somebody who speaks a Polish Yiddish, a Polish Yiddish, because I know Litvak Yiddish.
Yeah, absolutely. The dialects are complicated because, and then again, well, we start with the because. Dialects are complicated because the Yiddish world established specific ways of speaking for every little location. And there's a map. People have done a lot of linguistic work mapping how everybody would have spoken in a particular place in Eastern Europe. And then when people come to the New World, to the United States, Canada, etc., the question of what happens to your dialect, chances are you're going to marry somebody who might not have exactly the same dialect as you. And then the children maybe speak more than one. And what is the correct dialect? And so people used to argue about this. It's kind of a moot point now, because when Yiddish is taught in the classroom, there's usually a version of the language called Klal Yiddish, which is sort of standard Yiddish, which is
Yivo
textbook. Yeah, Yivo Yiddish. And it's neither. It's no dialect. So I'm always careful when I teach to tell my students, if you're learning Yivo Yiddish, just know that that is not a way that anyone historically spoke in Eastern Europe, unless they were the child of a linguist. You know, people would have had their different ways of speaking. But to me, it just speaks to the richness of the language. And one of the things I think that is fantastic about the new media we have access to now online is how much we can hear people from different places speaking Yiddish in their own dialect. So if you go onto the Yiddish Book Center website, there's something called the Wexler Oral History Project, which I'm sure people in this room listening have participated in, where you're interviewed by someone, either in English or Yiddish, about your connections with the culture. And there you can hear, I don't know the number at this point, I would guess 100 or more interviews with people in Yiddish, speaking in their dialect about their experiences of Yiddish. There's also the digitization of interviews with Holocaust survivors, which obviously the topic is not Yiddish, but you can hear them speak in Yiddish. And so this is the thing that scholars are calling afterlives, Yiddish afterlives, that Yiddish is living on in this frozen media state. We can go watch videos of people who are no longer with us and listen to them. But what do we do with that? So do we learn from them linguistically? We can't have a conversation with them, but there is some sort of an engagement that we can have with that technology. And that's becoming increasingly important in Yiddish.
My father was very involved in Yiddish, as I told you before, and he was very strong with Wilder Verein and with the Yiddish Folk Bibliothek, and he was the first one to bring Chaim Grade to Montreal. And the evening that he had all the writers in Montreal say hello, give a grüß, and they all spoke Litvak Yiddish, except for Chava Rosenfarb, who was the only one who, when she said hello to Chaim Grade, didn't have that dialect.
Yeah, this year, the city of Łódź honored her. They declared it the year of Chava Rosenfarb because it's the year of her birth. 2023 was last year. So she spoke, and you can hear recordings of her. Again, at the Yiddish Book Center, if you go onto the website there under the digital holdings, you can hear recordings of her that were done at the Jewish Public Library in Montreal and then digitized, and they're all online. You can download them and listen to them. Of Chava Rosenfarb speaking about, for example, her trilogy, Del Boim from Levin, The Tree of Life. You can hear her dialect, which is very distinctive of Łódź dialect, and she kept it her whole life. And so part of, I think, the vitality of the language, when all of those writers were active, was them bringing the richness of their vocabulary, their lexicon, their grammar, their pronunciation, and they would all come together and you would hear, 20 different versions of the language, ranging from, geographically this vast area from one end all the way to the other. One question that I have with Yiddish transmission is what are we transmitting when we talk about language transmission? So if you learn Yiddish in a classroom, you're learning the sort of standardized Yiddish, and then you go out into the world and if you speak to Hasidim in their communities, they're speaking what's called Hasidic Yiddish. People argue about whether that's its own dialect. It probably isn't a dialect as much as the usage within a particular community, which has its own variation. So different communities have different accents, different vocabulary, things like that. But if you're a learner of Yiddish and you go into those communities, you're hearing a very different kind of Yiddish. And if you're watching old movies, that's again a very different kind of Yiddish. So when we talk about, it's annoying to do this on Zoom with like moving your hands, so I'm going to do it slowly, but the authenticity. So what is authentic? What is real? It's almost an impossible marker now to gauge what authenticity means. And everybody talks about it. So you mentioned Hester Street. So this was an amazing movie that was made in the mid-1970s by Joan Micklin Silver, who was one of the very first female filmmakers in Hollywood. And it was hard for her to break into that space. She made Hester Street. It's, you know, half Yiddish subtitled dialogue. It's black and white. It feels like it was filmed, you know, in the 1890s, if that were possible. And the eye was towards making it look authentic in order to tell the story of these immigrant characters on the Lower East Side, New York, in the 1890s. But she had at her disposal people who remembered those times, so she could draw on them to make the dialogue and train them, coach the actors, and do whatever had to happen so it was authentic. And it was authentic in its own way, and now we look at it as its own authenticity. 1970s, here it is in a snapshot, and we keep sort of superimposing how we want to read this movie. If somebody's doing this today, it's more complicated. So if you want to build Yiddish dialogue into a movie, how do you do it? You go to the Yiddish theater and you get an actor who probably learned Yiddish in a classroom, or maybe was somebody who grew up in a Hasidic community. But how are you representing Yiddish? And what are you doing with dialect? What are you doing with all of that when we don't have the native speakers from all of those places anymore? So there's
one of the things I liked about your book was you talked about media of various kinds that are current, about movies specifically, that they are using Yiddish in movies and in other media. And I'm thinking about Shtisel, which had a lot of Yiddish in it. And is that authentic?
Well, that's the question. Yeah, and to me, this is such an interesting question. There's also, for example, there's a whole corpus of cinema that represents Hasidim, but it's always made by non-Hasidim. So there's, you know, in Montreal, famously, there was Félix Aimé, which got a lot of critical acclaim, where you have the main actress who memorized phonetically her Yiddish part. The same thing in Unorthodox, which was on Netflix, which a lot of people have probably seen. There you have Shira Haas, who's a famous Israeli actress, fantastic actress, also in Shtisel, and she phonetically memorized all of the dialogue that was given to her. The dialogue was created by Lily Rosen, who's a native Yiddish speaker from a Hasidic community. So there's a transmission from a Hasidic speaker to a non-Yiddish speaker who memorizes the dialogue and then delivers it. It's one way that people are finding Yiddish, and they're hearing it and they're saying, wow, I want to go learn that language. I want to learn more about that culture. But we have to say cultures because it's so fragmented and splintered, and we don't have arbiters anymore. We don't have the authority figures who say, I come from traditional Eastern Europe. I am a native speaker from my shtetl or from Łódź or from whatever place. I grew up with Yiddish. I was immersed in Yiddish. I'm a fluent speaker. I know the grammar. I know the vocabulary. What you're doing is incorrect. We don't have those people in our world anymore. And in a way, it's liberating, because I used to get told a lot that I was never going to be a real Yiddish speaker. And I took that to heart. And now I say, you know what, I'm as real as I can be. But on the other hand, there's a loss there. We don't have our traditional speakers anymore outside of the Hasidic communities. And there's a loss there that we have to acknowledge.
You talked about Shira Haas having to learn Yiddish, and yet she's from Israel. And Israel doesn't seem to be the place where Yiddish is living, as you would put it.
You know what, Yiddish is in Israel is an interesting story. Officially, there was a lot of state effort to make Israeli Hebrew the hegemonic language. And a lot of it is just logistics, right? So if you want to run a military, you can't have 20 languages. You have to have a unified language. And the state of Israel was born immediately into warfare. And so there was a lot of effort to create one unified Israeli modern culture, which meant repressing, suppressing, forgetting, pushing aside everything that everyone came with when they landed on the shores. And there's a loss in that. Then there's a willful forgetting. And Yael Chaber wrote a book about this, where she says, what is the psychological cost of having a country built on the forgetting of everybody's language and culture when they arrive? But there's also a joy in building something new. So Israeli folk dance, Israeli singing, all of those things that my generation grew up with in school and in summer camp. For us, it was a joyful space. We didn't think of it as a hegemonic suppression of da-da-da. We thought this is fun. Israeli folk dancing, falafel, it's fun, it's our culture. And since then, Israeli scholars and artists have gone back and looked at that the same way that people outside of Israel have looked at that and said, you know what, we need to go back and reclaim, we need to go back and dig. And what scholars have found is that Israel never fully suppressed Yiddish. There were moments that are famous, you know, people speaking Yiddish on the street and being told, don't do that. And there was some violence in Israeli Yiddish newspapers having their offices attacked. But overall, scholars have found that, you know, slowly but surely, there was a Yiddish theater that was pretty much constant, mostly comedy, because the drama, the serious stuff belonged to the Israeli theater, but there was always a Yiddish theater presence. And there are great things, Yiddish works that came out of Israel, like Itzik Manger's Die Megillah. It was a beautiful production by Dov Zeltzer and company, which is still sung today. And we have artists and writers, Avraham Sutzkever, the poet and essayist and luminary, considered maybe the most important Yiddish figure of the post-Holocaust period in terms of all of his work. He was living in Israel in Tel Aviv.
In Israel, but he had his own issues in Israel, maintaining the value of Yiddish in their society.
Yeah, it was a struggle. And really, my hat goes off to all of the people who upheld Yiddish in, you know, that the state of opposition that they faced. And I would say that's not just limited to Israel, that people who decided to be writers and poets and maintain their connections to Yiddish struggled, because people said to them, and this is true for the Montreal writers too, why don't you switch to English? Why are you bothering to write in a language no one reads? And Chava Rosenfarb commented on this a lot later in her life, where she said, I'm a ghost. You know, I have no one who can read me. Isaac Bashevis Singer in the 1970s said this. He said, I'm a ghost. I love ghosts. I write about ghosts. My language is a ghost. And in Israel, it was particularly difficult because there was this mainstream culture that was really pushing against maintaining that connection to the Yiddish shtetl, to that sort of non-idealized soldier that became the figure of what, you know, modern Israeli culture wanted itself to be. That having been said, some of the most exciting Yiddish activity that I know of has come out of Israel in the last 10, 15 years. There's theater, there's music, there's a Yiddish summer program at the Tel Aviv University. There's this generation of Israelis who are gravitating towards other versions of looking at their identity, looking at the past, looking at what they can be. And they are learning Yiddish and working in Yiddish. And it's not always an oppositional thing. Very often it's together with their sense of being Israeli or being whatever else. You know, it's one of many ways of defining yourself, where you don't have to say, I have to choose just one. Obviously, with the very really huge splintering of Israeli society that's, you know, happened, and I'm not even going to talk about the violence and the terrible situation. We're all aware of what's happening there. Israel's a very complicated, fragmented, multifaceted place, and Yiddish is one piece of the many different sort of trends and streams that are happening there.
So what about the future? Are you worried about it? Where you don't have those, you don't remember the nostalgia, or you have to rediscover it? What's the future for Yiddish? Is it going to live on?
It's definitely living on. It's going to become increasingly unrecognizable. Like if we brought Chaim Grada as an example, we brought Chaim Grada and set him in our world today and said, look at all the Yiddish that's happening. He would be really mystified, because why would all of these, particularly young people, want to be gravitating towards a language that isn't spoken in their house, not even necessarily in their community? Why are they being so countercultural around this language? And in some sense, engaging with Yiddish is kind of countercultural. You're going against the grain. The grain is speak the language of the place where you live. It's comfortable. You know, you can have your religious orientation or your cultural orientation, but why are you struggling to learn a language that isn't used out in the mainstream? Why is that important? And I think it is just one way in our world today of people finding out who they are, expressing their identities, becoming creatives, deepening their knowledge of Jewishness or sometimes other traditions. And I think there's just this very, very, very vibrant, exciting space that's completely, it's a virtual space. It's completely decentered. There's no geographic location where you have to go somewhere to engage with Yiddish. There are festivals happening all over the world. There are people located all over the world. So I'm very, very optimistic about the future of Yiddish, but I have to underline how different it is from what it was 100 years ago. Even in the Hasidic world, where in the Hasidic ethos, there's this idea that they are direct transmitters of an authentic tradition in Eastern Europe. But in the 1960s, their rabbis had to say to them, you know what, Satmar, we should stop speaking so much Hungarian. Let's return to Yiddish. And the Satmar Rebbe did this in the 1960s, in the post-war period. He said, we need to go back to Yiddish. And they started really emphasizing that. And so what we've got in a lot of Hasidic sects is we've got Yiddish speakers today who speak better than their grandparents, because the grandparents had to learn and return, and the children are native speakers. So it's a world of constant flux and shift and change. I think it's a really, really exciting space to be. I want to read this poem that you shared with me, which I love this poem, and I did not, how could I know it was about you? I could not have known that. So Ida Maza, and here's an example of sort of what I'm talking about in the book. Ida Maza is a Yiddish poet and novelist who was active in Montreal, and she started publishing poetry as a really young person and was encouraged by other writers like Yud Siegel in Montreal to publish. And so she started publishing her poems. And then in 1954, she published a collection of poems for children called Wachsen meine Kinderlach, which have found this new audience, particularly post-COVID. There are artists who have been reading the poems, translating them. Her novel Dina was just recently translated into English. So Ida Maza has sort of a new cult following in the Yiddish world. People know her name. So she wrote a poem about you. Do you want to say something about how this poem came to be? Or should I read it? Yeah.
I don't remember much about it, but the poem is called Oyster, which is my Yiddish name. And Oyster is a particular name that comes from a particular part of Eastern Europe, from Vilna. There's not a lot of people who have the name Oyster. It is translated to a certain degree to be Azer, like Azer Weizmann, but it was particular about that. And I don't remember much. It was written in 1954, published in 1954. So I must have been about 4 or 5 when she actually wrote it. And I think she liked the name Oyster, and that's why she chose to write it in Yiddish. When you read it, you'll probably hear the rhythm of the name, and that's the beauty of Yiddish, is the rhythm that you get when you read or speak Yiddish.
Absolutely. And Oyster, I mean, we'll make this into a sort of test question. I'm going to read the poem, and then everyone can, if you don't already know, guess what the word Oyster means, and then I will tell you. So I'm going to just share screen and read this poem. And you can see that there's a playfulness in Ida Maza's style. You can feel that she used to run a group for children in the Jewish Public Library where she would have the children around her, she would read to them, and they adored her. So that's the sort of mindset we're in. So I'm going to share this poem and read it aloud and then sort of offer a rough translation. Oyser. Unser Oyser gehält zu die Tiere nemmen, was die ganze Gas tut mit sich schämen. Ist umetum voll und jeder kennen, und als was will, is helfen nur jedem. Was einer tut, muss als tun, muss jederen helfen, mit was nur kann. Dem Segen ju helft die Brillen gefinnen, Der Bobbenju helft Meiselach spinnen. Dem Taten helft spielen in Schach. Der Mammen helft mit jedweder Sach. Der Schwesterl helft a Liederle kommen. Die Chaverimlach helft a Geltendel sammeln. Helft sie sich spielen, springen und tanzen. Helft sie die beten mit Kretelach pflanzen. Helft und helft mit alles, was kann, weil sein Name ist Oiser und darf azoi ton. So the riddle here, Oizel, means helper. And you can see if you speak Hebrew, la'azor, to help. So that's the name. And the poem roughly means our friend Oizel, he can't help but help everyone. So he helps his grandfather find his glasses. He helps his grandmother tell stories. He helps his father play chess. He helps his mother with everything. He helps his sister rhyme a song. He helps his friends sow a garden. He helps everyone play and jump and dance. He helps the flower beds by planting flowers. He helps with everything that he is able to because that's what he must, because that is his name. And I love this poem, and I love that I know the person it was written about. And that's a wonderful piece to sort of fit into that puzzle of the richness of Yiddish.
You know, there was poetic liberty taken that I never had a grandfather. And, a lot of it is for the Yiddish language, to be able to put the words together that sound so good.
Yeah, I figured it was semi-fictional. If you're playing chess as a 4-year-old, I was impressed. But I think that to me, that's sort of what I mean when I say I'm optimistic about Yiddish, and Yiddish transmission is ongoing and Yiddish lives on, because we can keep sort of cycling back and rediscovering treasures of Yiddish and then building on them and making new things. So I've seen this poem. I have a friend in Melbourne who is a songwriter who has asked me to share poems with her so she can set them to music. This is the poem I'm going to send her this week, and hopefully she'll do something, and then I'll share it with you, and then we'll start singing the song in the Yiddish world, and we'll post it online, and people will start rediscovering this poem that may not be well known today. And I think that's the cycle of Yiddish as it continues.
So Yiddish could live on, and I could live on too. At least my reputation for being helpful could live on.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're all immortal.
I'm really happy that the Canadian Truth Literary Awards gave you the award for this book, Yiddish Lives On. And I wish the best for you, that it lives on and you grow strength to strength along with Yiddish.
Thank you, and my commendations to everything that you do with the Yiddish Committee in Toronto. And I just want to say to everyone in this room who's involved with Yiddish, I send you my regards, my thanks, because this is a collective endeavor. There's no Yiddish person. Everything that we do contributes to building this Yiddish world. So, and I'd like to thank everyone for this opportunity to talk about a subject that I love. And Faisal, thank you so much for this conversation and this opportunity.
It's my pleasure.
Fabulous. Okay, so my friends, I know we're a tiny bit over, but I have some exciting news that even Edward Oiza does not know. I kept it as a surprise. So Rebecca did, in fact, reach out to her musician friend in Melbourne. And guess what? We are actually going to hear the poem set to music in a moment. Deanna is going to play the audio clip, and we're going to have the pleasure of listening to it. And Rivka has asked me to share these words on her behalf. If anyone doubts the power of created language spaces, I'd like to end with an original song composed by Tommy Kalinsky. Tommy is a Melbourne musician, director of the Milkumen On Yiddish Choir, and a Yiddish songwriter. I shared the poem Oizer with her. She adapted it and sent me this recording. This process underscores the lasting resonance that Yiddish has across vast distances and over time. Singt Gesundheit, which means sing in good health. So let's just listen, and Deanna's going to play the clip.
Ze Häuser gehört zu die teuren Männern, wo's die ganze Neckars gibt mit Session, mit Elson, mit Umfeld. Und jede Religion und alles, was will, ist helfen neuen. Was singen tut, muss als tun, muss jedem helfen, mit was noch kommt. Then say when you have fun, die Bäumen gefunden, die Morgen you have fun, Marcella spielen, den Tanten you have fun, spielen im Schach, der Mammen you have fun, mit jedem der Song, der Schwester wird helfen, ein Lieben mit Arme, die verwirren das Herz, ja, bin dort zusammen. Sie sich spielen, schwingen und tanzen, die Wälder zerpflanzen, helfen mit alles, was kommt, was ein Normen ist, und ihr Kraft war so toll, la 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 bum 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 bum.
You heard it here first, folks. That's the international premiere of that song interpretation of Oizel. So, Geschmack, delicious. On behalf of our community, I am so grateful to Rebecca for taking time out of her very busy schedule to create this marvelous presentation, and to Edward for just what a delightful interview, such really, really on point questions, and for this wonderful partnership with the Canadian Jewish Literary Awards. Hartstigen Dank beide. I wanted to just mention that Rebecca has said to people that if you have any questions for her about her presentation, you are welcome to email her. When Deanna sends out the recording next week, we will include Rivka's email. You can, ask her questions directly, and we'll also include a link to where you can purchase this wonderful publication. So very quickly, I hope you can join us for upcoming events. We have 2 more Meet the Author events coming in May. Heather Camlott is discussing The Prisoner and the Writer about the notorious Dreyfus Affair. And then in June, award-winning playwright and journalist Michael Posner is going to be discussing untold stories about Leonard Cohen, his 3-volume biography. Next Thursday, we have an art lecture at the JCC with Sarah Milroy, Chief Curator at the McMichael Gallery. All sorts of fabulous programs coming up, many of which are multi-access. So with that, I'm going to officially sign off. For those of you who celebrate Passover, I wish you all an early, happy, and healthy Pesach, Chag Sameach, and Good Yontef. It was a pleasure spending time with you all this afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you again soon, either in person or virtually at the Miles Nadal JCC.